The day Opal Graves rode into Redemption Creek on a borrowed mule with $3 and a busted lip, she told herself she was done making mistakes, but the truth was, she had been telling herself that for the better part of 5 years, and the mistakes kept coming all the same. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was doing what it always did in April, pretending to be beautiful while hiding thorns beneath every blade of grass. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of a dry gulch, a collection of weathered timber buildings and hand-painted signs that promised more than they delivered. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Rose, a small church nobody visited on weekdays, and a land office that seemed to do a brisk business in broken dreams. The kind of town that swallowed people whole and spit them out thinner and quieter than they had arrived. Opal was 26 years old, with dark copper hair that had not seen proper scissors in 4 months, and green eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain. She had a straight back even when she was tired, which people often mistook for pride, when really it was just the only thing she had left that nobody had managed to take from her. She wore a calico dress that had once been blue and was now the color of old sky, and her boots had a crack along the left sole that let in mud and cold water depending on the season. She dismounted outside the general store, tied the mule to the post, and stood in the street for a long moment just breathing. The town smelled like sawdust and horses and something frying in fat somewhere, and she let that ordinariness settle over her like a blanket. Ordinary was good. Ordinary was what she had been chasing for years without catching it. The inside of the general store was dim and smelled of dried herbs and leather. A woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger middle-aged, with the kind of face that had decided years ago to be neither friendly nor unfriendly, just efficient. "Help you," the woman said. "I am looking for work," Opal said. "Any kind. I can cook, I can sew, I can keep accounts if someone will trust me with a ledger. I learn fast." The woman studied her with the particular attention people in small towns gave strangers, cataloging the busted lip, the travel-worn dress, the set of Opal's jaw that said she was not going to apologize for showing up the way she had. "Verna Culp," the woman said finally, extending a hand. "Opal Graves. You running from something, Opal Graves." It was a direct question, and Opal had learned that direct questions in the West deserved direct answers, because evasion only made people more suspicious. "I am running towards something," Opal said. "I just have not figured out what yet." Verna considered this for a moment, then set down her pen. "I cannot give you work myself, but the Dusty Rose needs a cook. Clara Hutchins, who runs it, is not a bad woman. She would not cheat you on wages. I would stay away from the bar side of things if I were you. The men who drink there are not the worst in the territory, but they are not the best either." "I am not looking for men," Opal said, and meant it with every bruised fiber of herself. Verna gave her a small, knowing look that said she had heard that before and would likely hear it again. "The boarding house is run by a widow named Martha Fenn. $2 a month if you share a room. Tell her I sent you." Opal thanked her and left. She got the job at the Dusty Rose before the day was out. Clara Hutchins was a stout, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who smoked a pipe and kept a sawed-off shotgun under the bar, not because she was afraid, but because she believed in being prepared. She looked at Opal's hands, calloused, capable, and at the way she moved around the small kitchen at the back of the saloon without bumping into things, and hired her on the spot for $3 a week plus meals. "I run a clean establishment," Clara said. "The girls who work the floor know I do not require them to do anything they do not choose to do. You are cooking. That is all I am asking from you." "That is all I am offering," Opal said. "Good. We understand each other." Martha Fenn's boarding house was a 2-story affair at the quieter end of town, with a vegetable garden out back and curtains in the windows that had been washed recently. The room Opal shared was with a schoolteacher named Agnes Webb, who was 23 and from Ohio, and who had come west to teach, and had fallen in love with the idea of the frontier without fully understanding what the frontier would require of her. Agnes was kind in the particular way of people who had not yet been truly tested, and Opal found herself protective of that kindness without quite knowing why. "Where did you come from?" Agnes asked on the first night, sitting on her side of the room brushing her pale hair. "Everywhere," Opal said, and that was true enough. She had come from a farm in Missouri that had failed when she was 19. From a marriage in Kansas at 20 that had seemed like salvation and turned out to be its own kind of drought. From a failed attempt at running a laundry in Abilene at 22. From a partnership with a man in New Mexico who had promised her a share of a silver claim and delivered nothing but debt and a bruised face. From 6 months working for a cattle outfit as a cook's assistant outside of Amarillo, which had ended when the outfit's owner decided that Opal's salary was less important than his gambling debts. She had made mistakes at every turn. She had trusted people she should not have trusted. She had stayed when she should have left and left when she should have stayed, and she had been naive and then too hard and then naive again in different ways. She had signed papers she had not read carefully enough. She had believed promises that men made when they wanted something from her and stopped believing them after they had taken it. 5 years of mistakes, accumulated like stones in a saddlebag, heavy and useless in hers. She did not tell Agnes any of this. She said she had come from Missouri and left it there, and Agnes, being polite and somewhat in awe of Opal's composure, did not press. The first 2 weeks in Redemption Creek were unremarkable in the best way. Opal cooked biscuits and gravy in the mornings, stews and roasted meat in the evenings, pies on Fridays that became something of a local institution within a fortnight. She was a genuinely good cook, and it was one of the few skills she had come by honestly, from her mother's kitchen in Missouri, a warm memory she kept polished and close. The men who came through the dusty rows ranged from ranch hands blowing a week's wages to traveling merchants to the occasional cowboy passing through on a cattle drive. They were mostly harmless and mostly ignored her, which was exactly how she preferred it. It was on a Friday afternoon, when she was delivering a peach pie from the kitchen to the bar, that she first saw Ira Mercer. He was sitting alone at the far end of the bar nursing a glass of water, not whiskey, which was unusual enough in a saloon to make her notice. And he was reading a folded newspaper that had to be at least 2 weeks old, given the nearest rail stop was 40 miles east. He was about 30 years old, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate without excess, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days of growth. His clothes were clean but worn, practical, a dark canvas coat, work trousers, boots that had seen a great deal of miles. He had a marshal's badge on his chest which explained the water. He looked up as she set the pie on the bar, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and then they both looked elsewhere, which was the polite and expected thing to do. Clara appeared from behind the bar. "Ira Mercer," she said to the man, "you going to drink anything with actual profit margin in it, or am I going to have to charge you for the water?" "Charge me for the water," he said pleasantly. "I will pay," Clara snorted. "You know I am teasing. What brings you through, tracking somebody?" "Checking in," he said. "Heard you had some trouble with a card cheat 2 weeks back." "Resolved itself," Clara said. "Man left town before I had to encourage him to do so." Ira nodded, folding his newspaper carefully. "Glad to hear it." He glanced toward the kitchen where Opal had retreated, and Clara, who missed nothing, followed his gaze. "New cook," Clara said. "Good one, too. Do not get any ideas." "I never get ideas," Ira said, and there was something in his voice that was dry and self-aware enough that Clara laughed. Opal, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel, told herself she was not interested. She told herself this quite firmly, with the full authority of 5 years of evidence supporting her distrust of her own judgment where men were concerned. She went back to her kitchen. The town had a rhythm, and she settled into it. Monday through Saturday she cooked. Sunday mornings she sat in the back pew of the small church, not because she was particularly devout, but because the silence of a Sunday morning was one of the great unacknowledged luxuries of a hard life, and the church was the only place in town that reliably offered it. Agnes sometimes joined her. They would sit side by side without speaking much, and that was comfortable in the way that only real companionship could be. Ira Mercer came through town roughly every 10 days. He was a deputy marshal working out of the office in Tascosa, covering a large stretch of the panhandle that required a great deal of riding and not a great deal of paperwork, which seemed to suit him. He always sat at the end of the bar. He always drank water or occasionally coffee when Clara offered it. He always read his old newspaper with the focused attention of a man who treated every piece of information as worth having, even when it was 2 weeks stale. He was polite to everyone and familiar with no one, which Opal recognized as a particular kind of loneliness that dressed itself up as professionalism. She noticed these things against her will, the way you notice a stone in your boot, with irritation and an awareness that ignoring it was not actually making it go away. The third time he came through, he sat at the small table near the kitchen rather than at the bar, which was unusual. Clara brought him his water and a bowl of the beef stew Opal had made, and he ate with the deliberate appreciation of a man who had been eating trail food and was genuinely grateful for something better. When she came out to collect the empty bowl, he said, "This is good, the stew." "Thank you," she said, and picked up the bowl. "Did you put juniper in it?" She paused. That was not a question she had expected. Most men either did not notice what they were eating or did not have the vocabulary to ask about it. "A small amount," she said. "It balances the game meat." "Are you a cook?" "No," he said. "My mother used to put juniper in her stew. I had not tasted it since I was about 12. Did not know that was what I had been missing." It was an unexpectedly honest and human thing to say, and Opal, who had built reasonably good defenses, felt them register the impact of it without quite falling. "Your mother was from where?" she asked, because it was a natural follow-up question and not because she was interested. She was not interested. "Colorado originally," he said. She had Ute neighbors growing up, learned things from them. He said it simply, without either the dismissiveness or the exaggerated romanticism that people usually brought to mentions of native people, and that also registered somewhere in Opal's careful inventory of him. "I am Ira Mercer," he said. "I know," she said. "Clara mentioned I am Opal Graves." "I know," he said with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Clara mentioned." She went back to her kitchen. She stood over the stove for a moment with the empty bowl in her hands, and told herself quite sternly to stop noticing things about him. By May, the prairie around Redemption Creek was coming into its brief and violent bloom, wildflowers pushing through the hard ground in yellows and purples, the sky enormous and impossibly blue, the wind carrying the smell of fresh grass for the first time since autumn. It was the kind of beauty that hurt a little, because it was temporary and you knew it. On a warm evening, Opal was sitting on the back step of the Dusty Rose after the dinner service, letting the night air cool her down. She had her shoes off. Her feet were tired in the deep way of someone who stood on hard floors for 10 hours, and she was looking at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary with stars. She heard footsteps on the dirt, and then Ira Mercer came around the corner of the building, stopped when he saw her, and had the good grace to look apologetic. "Sorry," he said. "I did not know anyone was here. I was going to see if there was a back door to ask Clara about something." "There is," Opal said, nodding at the door behind her. "She is still inside." He should have just gone to the door. Instead, he stopped and looked at the sky the way she had been looking at it and said, "Lord, that is something." "Yes," she agreed, against her better judgment. He sat down on the fence post a few feet away, not presumptuous, not crowding her, just sharing the same view, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, which was either awkward or comfortable, and she could not quite decide which. "You have been here about 6 weeks," he said. "7," she corrected. "7, you plan to stay." "I plan to stay as long as it makes sense to stay," she said, which was the most honest thing she could offer. "That is honest," he said. "I have found that honesty is more efficient in the long run." "Is that something you learned by being dishonest first?" She looked at him sharply. He was not being unkind. His face was composed but not calculating, More like he was genuinely curious in the way that some people were genuinely curious about things without agenda. "It is something I learned by being naive first," she said. "Which is different." He accepted that. Fair enough. They sat in the silence for another moment, and then she put her shoes back on, because it felt strange to be barefoot in front of someone she did not know well, even if he was not looking at her feet, and she went back inside. She lay awake for a while that night, which she resented. The trouble started in June. It came in the form of a man named Deke Culver, who arrived in Redemption Creek with 3 companions, and a reputation that preceded him the way bad weather preceded itself, in a change of pressure and a particular quality of tension in the air. Deke Culver was a land speculator of the worst sort, not the kind who bought land and developed it, but the kind who used legal pressure, intimidation, and outright fraud to acquire land from people who did not always understand what they were signing. He set his eye on a parcel of land at the north end of town that belonged to a man named Jonas Webb, Agnes's uncle, who had come out west 10 years earlier and built a modest but successful cattle operation. Jonas Webb was 52 years old and had a bad leg from an old injury and no sons, just Agnes, who was his only family in the territory. Culver showed up at the land office with papers that purported to show a debt Jonas had not known he owed, to a creditor Jonas had never heard of. The papers were skillfully done, not obviously fraudulent, but troubling. Agnes came to Opal in a panic on a Tuesday evening, clutching a folded letter that Jonas had sent her. Opal read it carefully because she was good at reading carefully now, having learned at considerable personal cost what happened when she was not. "This debt instrument has irregularities," Opal said. "What kind of irregularities?" "The notarization date is before the date of the original agreement, which makes no logical sense. And the witness signature, this is a common trick. They use a name that sounds real but the person does not exist. I have seen this before." She folded the letter with the controlled movements of someone keeping their anger contained. "I have had this done to me, in New Mexico with a silver claim." Agnes stared at her. "What should we do?" "Get Ira Mercer," Opal said. It was the first time she had named him in relation to a problem, and she noticed that she had named him before she had thought about whether she wanted to, which told her something. She found him the next morning at the livery stable, where he was saddling his horse to ride out. She explained the situation quickly and clearly. She had always been able to organize facts when she needed to, even when her feelings were less organized, and he listened with the full, focused attention of someone who did not require information repeated. When she finished, he said, "Do you still have the letter?" "I have it." "Can I see it?" She handed it over. He read it once, twice, then folded it and handed it back. "You are right about the notarization date," he said. "I need to ride to Tascosa and pull Culver's prior cases from the territorial records. I have heard his name before in connection with this kind of thing. I can be back in 3 days. 3 days is a long time if he is already pressing Jonas Webb." Ira looked at her. "Is there someone in town Jonas trusts who can stall the land office? Make sure nothing gets filed until I get back." "Verna Culp is on the land office board," Opal said. "I think she would delay proceedings for cause." "Good. Go to Verna. Tell her I am investigating." That should be enough for her to slow things down. He swung up onto his horse, a dark bay gelding that looked capable of genuine distance, and then paused. "You have dealt with this kind of fraud before personally?" "Yes," she said. "Did you lose the claim?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I am sorry that happened to you." He said it like he meant it, without qualification, and without the particular patronizing quality that sympathy from men often carried, as though her having been defrauded was somehow connected to a failure of character on her part. He just said it, and then he rode out, and Opal stood in the street and let herself feel the unexpected weight of being believed. She went to Verna. Verna, who turned out to be made of considerably sterner stuff than her efficient demeanor suggested, went to the land office that afternoon and informed the clerk that a filing moratorium on the Webb property was in effect pending a federal investigation. Culver's man who had been at the land office that morning went away without his filing, and when he reported back to Culver, there was a tension in the saloon that evening that Clara managed by cleaning her shotgun very visibly at the bar. Ira came back in 2 days, not 3. He had ridden hard and it showed, but he had the records he needed: 3 prior instances of the same fraud in 2 different territories, 2 of which had resulted in indictments that had somehow dissolved before trial, but left a paper trail that, combined with the current fraudulent instrument, constituted enough for a federal warrant. He arrested Deke Culver on a Thursday morning in front of the Dusty Rose, which was not the worst place for it from a theatrical standpoint, and Culver's 3 companions decided that the mathematics of the situation did not favor resistance and rode out of town before noon. Jonas Webb kept his land. He came into town on Saturday to thank Opal personally, shaking her hand with both of his and saying that Agnes had told him it was Opal who had spotted the fraud and who had acted. He was a weathered, dignified man with a limp and steady eyes, and the gratitude was genuine. "You saved something I built 30 years of my life into," he said. "You might thank the deputy marshal," Opal said. "He did the legal work." "I will," Jonas said. "But Agnes tells me you recognized what was being done because it was done to you once. That is a hard kind of knowledge to have, and I am grateful you had it." Opal nodded and excused herself to the kitchen because her eyes were doing something she did not have good control over, and the kitchen was private. That evening, when the dinner service was done and the saloon had quieted to a few lingering patrons, Ira was at his usual spot at the bar end, and Opal brought out a slice of the apple pie she had made and set it in front of him. "On the house," she said. "Clara says so." He looked at the pie, then at her. "Thank you." She almost walked away. She had been walking away from conversations with him at the point when they became interesting, consistently and deliberately, because she knew herself well enough to know that interesting conversations with him led to things she was not ready for. But she was tired of walking away. She was tired of punishing herself for having made mistakes by refusing to let anything new in. She sat down on the stool next to him, which was unprecedented, and said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," he said, in a tone that did not make it a big thing. "I have made every mistake a woman could make out west," she said. It came out direct and unvarnished, the way she had practiced saying hard things when she had to. "I married wrong at 20. I trusted wrong at 22. I signed papers I should not have signed. I stayed in places I should have left. I believed men who did not deserve to be believed. I am 26 years old, and I have the track record of someone who has been falling downstairs for 5 years." He listened to all of this without interrupting, without changing his expression, without the particular quality of polite discomfort that people showed when they were listening to something they did not know how to respond to. Then he said, "Good." She blinked. "Good." "Good," he said again, and there was nothing flippant in it. He turned slightly on his stool to face her more fully. "Every mistake you have made, you have already made it. You will not make those same ones again. You know what a fraudulent debt instrument looks like. You know what kind of man makes promises he will not keep. You know when to leave and when you have stayed too long. That is not a track record of failure. That is the most expensive education available in this country, and you paid for it and you have it." He paused. "The woman who came here 7 weeks ago barefoot on someone else's mule, she is not the same woman who spotted that notarization error and walked to Verna Culp before 9 in the morning. Is she?" Opal looked at him for a long moment. The saloon was quiet around them, just the creak of the building and the distant sound of horses outside. "No," she said, "she is not." "Then good," he said. "Now you will not make new ones." He meant it practically. She knew as a matter of experience and learned judgment. But it landed like something much larger, like permission or absolution or the very specific gift of being seen without being diminished, and she sat with that for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "You are an unusual man, Ira Mercer," she said. "I have been told," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, and that small, contained expression of warmth was somehow more affecting than a broad smile would have been. She slid the pie closer to him. "Eat that before it gets cold." He did. They sat in companionable silence for a while, and she did not leave, and he did not press her for more conversation, and it was the best evening she had spent in a long time. She told Agnes about it when she came home, not everything, but the essential thing, the thing he had said, and Agnes sat up in her bed with her hair in her braid, and her face lit up the way it got when something moved her. "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard," Agnes said. "It was practical," Opal said. "It was practical and romantic," Agnes said firmly. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive." Opal lay in the dark and thought that Agnes, for all her untested kindness, was frequently right about things. July arrived with the full weight of a Texas summer, and Redemption Creek baked in it. The air above the main street shimmered, and the water in the rain barrels went warm, and the horses at the livery stood in the shade with their heads down, and their tails moving slowly. Opal cooked in a kitchen that was approximately the temperature of the inside of a bread oven, which was the kind of hardship that quietly built character while you were too busy sweating to notice. Ira came through every 10 days or so, as he always did, but now he consistently sat at the table near the kitchen rather than at the bar end, and he and Opal had developed the kind of easy, unforced conversation that is one of life's rarer gifts, talk that moved between the practical and the reflective, without either participant feeling required to perform anything they were not. He told her about his work, which was interesting in its specifics. The Panhandle was a complicated territory in 1878, with land disputes between cattle outfits and settlers, tensions between the large ranching operations and the smaller homesteaders trying to establish themselves, occasional trouble from men who had ridden on the wrong side of the law during the war and the years after it, and had never fully committed to the alternative. He was thoughtful about his work in a way that went beyond mere procedure. He cared about the difference between law and justice, and he knew they were not always the same thing, which made him careful in a way that purely law-bound men were not. "I arrested a man last month," he said one evening, "for stealing a horse. He had 3 children and a wife and had lost his own horse to a flash flood 3 weeks prior. He had walked 30 miles looking for work and found none. I arrested him because I had to. Horse theft is horse theft, and I cannot make exceptions or the whole frame of it falls apart. But I also went to the man whose horse was stolen and explained the situation, and that man, whose name is Baxter, is a rancher and a decent one, agreed to call it a loan against future labor. The thief works for Baxter now. No trial." "And the law was satisfied?" Opal asked. "The law was satisfied," he said. "The horse was returned. The man feeds his family. Nobody hangs." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the job done right. It does not always work out that way. And when it does not, then I carry it," he said simply. "There is not another option." She told him things too, by degrees, the way trust is built, not in one great confession but in small offerings made over time, each one testing whether the ground would hold before placing more weight on it. She told him about the farm in Missouri, about her parents who had worked it and loved it and lost it to a bank that had called in the loan during a bad harvest year, about her mother, who had taught her to cook and to keep accounts and to read everything twice, about her father, who had been a gentle and defeated man whose gentleness she had loved and whose defeat she had feared finding in herself. She told him about the marriage in Kansas. His name had been Curtis, and he had been handsome and charming in the way of men who had early learned that handsome and charming were tools that got them what they wanted. And he had wanted a wife who would manage his household and not trouble him about the rest of his affairs. And Opal had been too young and too lonely after the farm to see it clearly. The marriage had been cold and contractual from the inside even when it looked adequate from the outside. And when Curtis had decided to move them to New Mexico without consulting her, and without explaining why, she had discovered that the reason was a woman in Wichita he had not mentioned, and she had left. The divorce had been difficult and expensive and humiliating in the way that leaving was always expensive for women in those years, when the law was not designed with their exits in mind. Ira listened to all of this without judgment. He asked questions that were clarifying rather than probing, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than someone assembling a case. "The silver claim," he said one evening. "Tell me about that." She had mentioned it in passing several times but had never detailed it. She looked at her hands on the table, capable, scarred from kitchen work, and decided to tell it straight. "His name was Everett Park," she said. "He was educated, articulate, knew how to present a thing so it sounded reasonable. He showed me the claim paperwork, explained that 2 investors were needed to cover the surveying and filing costs, that the silver was there, and it was a matter of weeks. I invested everything I had, $200, which was 2 years of what I had saved working in Abilene." She paused. There was no silver, there was no legitimate claim. He had done it 8 times before in 3 territories. He was arrested eventually, but the money was gone. All the investors lost everything. "I am sorry," Ira said, as he had said before, with the same uncomplicated sincerity. "The worst part," she said, "was that I had read the papers. I thought I was being careful. But I did not know what I was reading well enough to know what was missing from it." She looked at him. "That is why I could read Jonas Webb's papers correctly. I had learned expensively exactly what to look for." "Exactly," he said, and the word was a quiet affirmation of what he had told her months ago, that her mistakes had made her something, had shaped her into someone who could do things she could not have done before. She looked at him across the table and felt something she had been avoiding feeling for weeks with considerable effort, something warm and large and cautious all at once. "Ira," she said. "Yes. What is your story?" "You know mine in more detail than most people who have known me for years." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the quality of his stillness change slightly, moving from ease to something more careful. "I grew up in Colorado," he said. "My father ran a trading post, honest work. He treated everyone who came through with the same respect regardless of who they were. He traded with white settlers and Ute people alike, and he never cheated anyone. I learned what I know about fairness from him." He paused. "He died when I was 18, fever. My mother went back east to her sister's family. I stayed." Another pause. "I was engaged once. A woman named Ruth in Tascosa. She was a good person. She died of fever too, 2 years after we were engaged. I was 24. Opal said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was adequate. She just let the information stand. "That is the whole of it, more or less," he said. "I have been doing this work since I was 22. I am good at it. I have not had much else for a while." "Do you want more than this?" she asked, and the question was larger than the words, but it was also honest, and she did not take it back. He looked at her with that steady, frank attention that she had come to realize was his most fundamental quality, the unwillingness to look away from things. "Yes," he said, "I do." The word sat between them, and neither of them said anything after it for a moment. And then Clara Hutchins came through from the bar side, loudly asking if there was any pie left. And the moment broke into the ordinary business of the evening, and Opal went to the kitchen, and Ira stayed until the saloon closed. She did not sleep well that night, but it was the good kind of not sleeping, the kind where you are turning over something valuable and trying to understand its dimensions. In August, Agnes Webb received a letter from the Ohio Teachers Board informing her that her contract had been renewed, but that there had been a complaint about her teaching that she needed to address before the fall term. The complaint was from the parents of one of her students, who objected to Agnes having taught the class about the history of the territory, in a way that acknowledged the prior habitation of the land by the Comanche and Kiowa peoples, with what they called undue sympathy. Agnes was devastated, not because she feared losing her position exactly, but because she had taught the truth as she understood it and was being told the truth was inconvenient. She sat at the kitchen table in Martha Fenn's boarding house and held the letter with both hands and looked like someone had hit her. Opal read the letter carefully. Then she sat down across from Agnes. "The complaint names one family," she said. "The Harrow family." "Their son is in my class," Agnes said miserably. "He is actually a bright boy." "The board's response does not say you must stop teaching history accurately," Opal said. "It says you must address the complaint. You can write a letter to the board explaining your methodology and your sources. You can document that your teaching was factually accurate. You can invite them to review your curriculum." Agnes looked up. "Would that work?" "It might. It depends on whether the board prefers comfort over accuracy. Some do, but you do not know yet, so try the honest approach first." Agnes wrote the letter that week, a careful, documented, dignified letter that laid out her curriculum and cited the source material she had used, including federal records, territorial surveys, and 2 published histories. She sent it on a Tuesday. The board wrote back in 3 weeks to say that they had reviewed her curriculum and found it appropriate, and that the complaint had been noted but would not affect her position. Agnes came running into the dusty Rose kitchen waving the letter, and Opal held her while she cried from relief, and thought that there were small victories, and they should be treated with the same seriousness as large ones. It was around this time, in the long warm evenings of late August, that Ira began spending a portion of his time in Redemption Creek that was not strictly official business. He would arrive in the afternoon and be done with whatever official business had brought him by early evening, and then he would sit at the table by the kitchen and drink Clara's coffee and talk to Opal until the saloon closed. Clara, who missed nothing, said nothing about it to Opal directly. She said things in other directions obliquely, like, "Ira Mercer is the most decent man currently operating in this territory in my professional opinion, which is worth something. And that badge does not make him cold, which is the mistake people make about lawmen. And once simply, he looks at you like you are the only honest thing he has found in a long time." Opal took all of this in without comment. What she felt, she was having difficulty labeling with the precision she preferred to apply to things. It was not the consuming, blind, headlong feeling of her marriage, which had felt urgent and necessary, and had turned out to be panic dressed up as love. It was something quieter and more settled, more like the feeling of finding your footing on rocky ground, not thrilling exactly, but profoundly real and reliable, the kind of thing you could put your weight on. She trusted Ira Mercer. That was the beginning and the remarkable thing about it, because she had not trusted a man since before Curtis, since before her father's defeat had taught her that the men she loved could be taken from her by forces beyond their control, and maybe she had never fully trusted one. But she trusted Ira, and it was not a decision she had made. It was something that had accumulated in her, deposit by deposit, like silt building up to something solid. One evening in late August, there was a thunderstorm, the sudden, violent kind that the panhandle produced without warning, all lightning and vertical rain and the smell of the earth opening up to receive it. The saloon emptied quickly as people ran for shelter, and within 20 minutes it was just Clara and the bartender she employed on evenings and Opal and Ira, the thunder making the building shake gently around them. Clara looked at the rain lashing the windows and said, "I am closing the bar early. James, go home before it gets worse. Opal, you cannot walk to Martha's in this. Stay until it passes." She looked at Ira. "You too, I suppose. I am going upstairs." She went upstairs with the finality of a woman who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. The bartender left. The building settled into the quiet of the storm. Opal and Ira sat at the table, and she poured them both coffee from the pot on the stove. And outside, the lightning turned the whole sky white every few minutes, and between the cracks of thunder there was just the rain. "Tell me something about yourself that is not connected to anything difficult," she said, because they had shared enough difficult things and she wanted to know the other parts too. He thought for a moment. "I used to paint," he said. "When I was young, watercolors, not well, but I liked it." She looked at him. "I would not have guessed that. My mother taught me. She was better at it than I was. She said the point was not to make something beautiful. The point was to look at something long enough to understand it well enough to paint it. The looking was the thing. He turned his coffee cup between his hands. I have not had the materials or the time in years, but I still look at things the way she taught me, trying to see them clearly enough to understand them. Something about this explained a great deal about him to her, the quality of his attention, the way he listened, the patience of his observations. She felt a sudden tenderness for the boy he had been, learning to look at the world carefully from a woman who loved him. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked. She had not planned to ask it, and it came out before she had vetted it, and she felt her heart move in the way it did when you said something true before you could stop yourself. The lightning came through the window and lit his face, and he looked at her with that open, direct attention and said, "Someone who has been fighting her whole life and is tired of having to fight alone, and someone who has more grace than she gives herself credit for." The rain fell. Opal set down her coffee cup. She looked at him across the table, at the dark lines of his face in the lamplight, at the steadiness of him, at the things she recognized in him, the loneliness that was not defeat but was patience, the waiting without knowing what you were waiting for. "I think I have been waiting to not be afraid," she said. "I think I have been waiting until I had enough evidence that it was safe to stop being afraid." "And," he said, "and I think the evidence is in," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, just covered her hand with his, the way you would steady something, the way you would say "I am here" without saying it. And she let him, and it felt like breathing after a long time of breathing carefully and shallowly, like something expanding to its proper size. They sat like that while the storm moved through, and when the rain lightened to a soft, steady drizzle, he walked her back to Martha Fenn's boarding house through the wet, dark streets, and at the gate he said, "I would like to come calling if that is acceptable, properly, with your permission." She looked at him in the soft rain. "It is acceptable," she said. "And Ira, I would like to say something. Yes, I have made every mistake a woman can make out west. I have been clear about that. And I do not need you to protect me from the consequences of that, or to manage me, or to make decisions for me. What I need is exactly what you have already been, honest and steady, and someone who sees me clearly and is not afraid of what he sees." "That is not a difficult thing to promise," he said. "Because that is already what you have." She went inside. Agnes was awake. She had been reading by candlelight, waiting for the storm to ease, and took one look at Opal and put down her book. "Something happened," Agnes said. "Nothing dramatic," Opal said, sitting on her bed with her damp hair around her shoulders, feeling something warm and luminous all the way through. "Your face says otherwise," Agnes said. "My face may be exaggerating slightly," Opal allowed, and Agnes laughed, and Opal laughed too, and the rain came down on the roof of Martha Fenn's boarding house in a pleasant, settling way that felt like a benediction. September came in clear and bright. The way the panhandle was beautiful when it chose to be, with light that had a particular quality in late summer, long and golden and without mercy, the kind of light that made everything look important. The wildflowers were gone, but the grass was tall and pale in the draws, and the evenings had the first suggestion of cool that would become cold by October. Ira came calling twice that week and 3 times the next, which was considerably more than his official schedule required, and which Clara observed with transparent satisfaction. He and Opal walked in the evenings along the edge of the gulch, where the light was best, and they talked about everything, about nothing, about the specific texture of their particular lives. On one of those walks she took his hand first without announcement, and he laced his fingers through hers in a way that felt entirely natural, as though they had always done it. "My father's land in Colorado," he said one evening, "is still mine, technically. I have been paying the property taxes from here. It is not much, maybe 40 acres and the trading post building which needs work, but it is good land." "Are you telling me you want to go back there someday?" she asked. "I am telling you it exists," he said carefully, "in case you wanted to know." She understood what he was saying without saying. She held his hand a little tighter. She had thought in her careful way about what the future might hold, and had tried to be honest with herself about what she wanted and what she was afraid of and the difference between the two. She wanted to stay. She wanted this, the walking in the evening light, the conversations over coffee, the feeling of being known and not diminished by the knowing. She wanted the solid, earthbound thing that was building between them, which was nothing like the frantic urgency of her marriage, and everything like what she had always suspected love was actually supposed to feel like before she had settled for less. She was afraid of her own judgment. That was the remaining fear, the quiet, persistent conviction that she had been wrong before and could be wrong again. That trust was a thing she had shown poor skill at placing. But she thought about what Ira had said in the saloon months ago, that she had made the mistakes, that she would not make new ones. And she thought about the ways her judgment had sharpened over 5 years of expensive education, the way she had seen through Culver's fraud in 5 minutes of reading what it had taken her whole history to be able to read, the way she had assessed Ira himself, not quickly, not with the naive faith of her younger self, but slowly and with evidence and over time. She had learned to look the way his mother had taught him, and what she saw was real. In October, on a bright cold afternoon with the wind out of the north carrying the first real edge of winter, Ira came to Redemption Creek and walked into the dusty Rose kitchen and said, "I have something I need to ask you." Opal was making a pie crust, her hands white with flour, and she looked at him and saw something in his face that was serious and careful and slightly terrified in a way she had never seen him be, and it was so uncharacteristic that she felt her heart accelerate. "All right," she said. He stood there in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I know you have had reason not to trust marriage, and I know you have reason not to trust your own judgment about men, and I have thought about whether this is the right moment, and I cannot determine that it is. But I also cannot determine that waiting longer is going to change anything fundamental, so I am going to be direct." He took a breath. "I love you, Opal Graves. I think I have loved you since you sat down beside me at the bar and told me your whole history without apology, because that is the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. I would like to marry you. I am not asking you to trust blindly. I am asking you to trust the evidence, which I hope I have given you over the last months. I am asking you to come to Colorado with me and help me rebuild something worth building." He paused. "And I am asking with full understanding that you are going to think about it carefully and rationally before you answer, because that is who you are and I would not have it any other way." The pie crust was going to need to be redone because her hands had stopped moving and the dough had been overworked. She noted this with the part of her mind that was always noting practical things, and then she set it aside entirely. "Ira," she said, "yes, I love you too." She said it straight, the way she said hard things. "I have loved you since you told me your mother put juniper in her stew and you had not tasted it since you were 12. Because that was the most unguarded thing a person has ever said to me, and I knew then that you were someone who let things mean something to them, which is the rarest and most valuable quality I can think of." He looked at her, and something in his face opened up in a way she had not seen before, not the contained, measured expression of a man who had learned to be careful with himself, but something unguarded and completely present, and it was so genuine that she felt it in her chest. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her flour-dusted hands in his, and she laughed at that, at the practicality of it, the flour, the kitchen, the utter lack of drama. And then he kissed her, and it was honest and warm and absolutely right, and she kissed him back with the full, uncomplicated conviction of a woman who had finally, after all of it, made a choice she had reason to trust. Clara walked into the kitchen 2 minutes later, took one look at them and said, "About time," and went back to the bar, and they heard her laughing to herself all the way across the saloon. They were married in November at the small church that Opal had been sitting in on Sunday mornings, with the Reverend Marsh officiating and about half the town present. because word had gotten around in the way it did in small places, and people wanted to be there. Agnes was Opal's attendant, wearing her best dress and crying the entire ceremony with the unself-conscious emotion of someone who felt things deeply and saw no reason to manage them. Verna Culp came and brought a practical wedding gift, a leather-bound account ledger and a set of surveying maps of the Colorado Panhandle region, which was, Opal told her, the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. Jonas Webb came in on his wagon and sat in the front pew and shook Ira's hand before the ceremony with the particular formality of a man who had decided someone had earned his respect. Clara closed the saloon for 2 hours in the afternoon and made the reception happen at the Dusty Rose because she was practical about sentiment. You felt it where you felt it, and you did not pretend otherwise. Opal wore a dress she and Agnes had made over 3 weeks from fabric she had chosen herself. A dark green wool that was not traditional but was warm and was the color of the creek water after rain. And she wore her hair up in a way that Agnes had pinned with care, with 2 small wildflowers from Martha Fenn's pressed collection worked in at the back. She carried nothing down the aisle except herself, and that was enough. When she stood across from Ira at the front of the church and looked at his face steady and open, and looking at her with the full, focused attention he gave to everything that mattered, she felt no panic, no uncertainty, no voice in the back of her mind questioning her own judgment. She felt the solid, sunlit thing that she had been walking toward for months without knowing its shape. She said "I do" with a conviction that surprised even herself with its depth. He said "I do" looking at her like she was the most honest thing he had found in a long time, exactly as Clara had described, and she understood now exactly what Clara had meant. They spent their first winter in Redemption Creek, because Ira had his commitments as deputy marshal through the end of the year, and Opal had a commitment to Clara, who needed time to find another cook. This was right and practical, and it also gave them time to be married in the ordinary way of it, in the daily closeness of a life shared rather than merely adjacent. They took a room above the general store that Verna rented to them, and it was small and warm and theirs, and Opal spent her evenings there reading and planning and writing letters. And Ira came home each day from whatever the job had required of him and sat across from her at the small table and told her about it. And she told him about her day, and the simple normalcy of this, the specific, beloved normalcy of being known and coming home to someone who wanted to know, was the thing she had not had a name for when she had been missing it. She was teaching herself things. She had found a book on land law in Verna's store, practical, dry, exactly her kind of reading, and was working through it with the methodical attention she brought to everything she decided to learn. She was corresponding with a woman in Colorado who ran a small accounting office and who had written back to Opal's initial inquiry with warmth and a list of recommended texts. She was, for the first time in her adult life, building something deliberately and with her eyes fully open. December brought snow to the Panhandle, which it did not always do, but did this year with commitment. 3 inches before Christmas and another 6 in early January that left the town quiet and white and oddly beautiful. Ira resigned his position with the marshal's office formally on the 1st of January, 1879, with a letter that was characteristically precise and respectful, and the chief marshal wrote back to say that Ira had been one of the finest deputies he had employed, and that his judgment and integrity would be difficult to replace. They left Redemption Creek on a Thursday in late January in a wagon Ira had purchased and loaded with their combined possessions, which were not many but were each deliberate and chosen. Clara walked them to the edge of town and stood in the cold with her pipe in her teeth and her eyes bright and sharp. "You come back and visit," she said to Opal. "I will," Opal said. "Thank you, Clara, for all of it." Clara said nothing to that, because she was not a woman who handled direct gratitude gracefully, but she squeezed Opal's hand once, hard, which said everything. Agnes was there too, in her coat and her good scarf, and she hugged Opal for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, "You were the bravest person I knew here." And Opal said, "You are the kindest one," and that was true on both sides. Verna Culp shook both their hands. "Good luck with the land," she said. "Account ledger is in the wagon. Do not lose it." "Never," Opal said. They drove north through the Winterpale Panhandle, and the country opened up around them the way it did when you were moving, bigger than you remembered, more patient than you felt, with a beauty that was not gentle but was real. The sky was the particular winter blue of the southern plains, cloudless and cold and enormous, and the grass bent in the wind and the creeks ran fast and clear from the recent snow. Ira drove and she sat beside him, and they talked and they were sometimes quiet, and when the days were long and the wind was cold, she pressed against his side for warmth and he put his arm around her, and the horses moved steadily north. It took them 2 weeks to reach the property in Colorado, following roads that became tracks and tracks that became memory and memory that became recognition. The particular shape of a hill, the bend of a creek, the way the mountains appeared on the horizon first as a suggestion, and then, over days, as a real and imposing fact. The property was exactly as he had described: modest, in need of work, and genuinely good. 40 acres of bottomland with a creek running through it, the old trading post building solid under its neglect, a second structure that had been a barn and could be one again with time and lumber. The land itself was lush relative to the Panhandle. The altitude was lower on the eastern slope, and the soil was deep and dark, and in the frozen January ground Opal could already see what spring would bring. They stood in front of the trading post building in the cold, looking at it, and she felt something she had not expected to feel: recognition. Not of the place, which she had never seen, but of the feeling. The feeling of standing somewhere that had potential, that was asking to be made into something, that was offering itself to people willing to work. "It needs a lot," he said. "I know," she said. "Good." He looked at her sideways, and she saw the reference to what he had said months ago register in his expression with something warm and a little undone. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. "Now I know what I am dealing with. I will not be surprised by it." He laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine in the cold air, and took her hand, and they went inside. Spring came to the Colorado property with the kind of generosity that the land occasionally provided, as if it had been saving something up. The creek ran full and fast from snowmelt, and the bottomland turned green in a way that made Opal stop what she was doing sometimes just to look at it, the specific green of land that had been rested and fed by deep water. They had repaired the trading post roof by March and cleaned the interior by early April, and Ira had rebuilt the barn with help from the 2 families who had settled on the adjacent land. A homesteading family named the Ortiz family, Miguel and Consuela, who had been there 3 years and knew the land and the seasons, and a couple named Henry and Dorothea Marsh, who had come from Virginia the year before and were still finding their way. The trading post had been Ira's father's living, and Ira saw no reason to abandon a working model. The nearest settlement of any size was 12 miles west, and the community of homesteaders scattered across the region had need of a reliable supply point: seed and tools and fabric and staple goods, and occasionally the kind of practical advice that came from someone who had spent time in the territory and understood its patterns. Opal took the accounts. This was not a demotion. It was the most critical function of any commercial enterprise, and she did it with the ledger from Verna and a precision that came from having seen, at her own cost, what happened when accounts were not kept honestly. By summer, they had a clear picture of what the business needed to sustain itself and grow, and she had identified 3 suppliers who were reliable and 2 who were not, and had made the relevant adjustments. Consuela Ortiz, who was 30 and practical and had survived things that Opal did not yet know the half of, came by one morning with her 2 youngest children in tow and found Opal at the table by the window with her ledger and said, without preamble, "You know what you are doing." "Most of the time," Opal said. Consuela sat down and poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove with the casualness of someone who has decided to be friends with you. My husband says your husband is the most straightforward man he has met in this territory. He means it as the highest possible compliment. I would agree with the assessment, Opal said. Consuela looked at her with the direct, warm attention of a woman who trusted her own perceptions. You are happy here? Yes, Opal said simply. Good, said Consuela and drank her coffee. That summer, Opal began to feel things changing in her body in ways she recognized from what her mother had told her, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks before she said anything to Ira, turning it over in the private way she turned over important things. She was not afraid, which surprised her. She had expected fear, given all the other times she had not been sure of things. But she was not afraid. She was something else, something that required a larger word than happy, something more like complete. She told him on a warm July evening, sitting on the step of the trading post with the light going orange and long over the creek bottom. She said it plainly, because that was how she said things. He was very still for a moment, and then he turned to look at her with a face that had all of its careful containment stripped away, just the open and genuine thing beneath it, and he said, Opal, and the way he said her name was like the word was the sum of everything. She leaned against him, and his arm came around her, and they sat there in the evening light with the creek running below them and the mountains going purple at their peaks in the distance. And she thought that this was what it felt like to arrive somewhere after a long journey, not the dramatic arrival of the stories, but the quiet one, the one where you look around and realize that the thing you have been walking toward is right here, that you are standing in it, that it is real and solid and yours. In March of 1880, their son was born, a boy they named Thomas, after Ira's father, Thomas James Mercer, born on a cold, clear night with Consuela Ortiz serving as midwife with calm and capable hands. He was a healthy, loud, red-faced boy with Ira's dark hair and Opal's green eyes, and when Ira first held him, he had the same expression he had worn that July evening, stripped completely bare of everything protective, just the real thing. Opal held Thomas and felt the completeness of it in a way that was physical and absolute. She looked at Ira across their son's head and said, We made something good. We made something good, he agreed, and his voice was rough in the way of voices that have been affected by things the speaker is not managing as carefully as usual. Life built itself around them in the following years with the kind of quiet, industrious joy that does not make for dramatic stories but is, in practice, the best possible kind of life. The trading post grew, not into something grand, but into something reliably needed, a fixture of the community that people counted on. Ira used his knowledge of the law and the territory to help their neighbors navigate the increasingly complicated landscape of land claims and water rights that came with the growth of settlement in the region, not as a lawman, but as a knowledgeable neighbor, freely offered. He was respected in a way that had nothing to do with a badge and everything to do with character. Opal ran the accounts and the supply side of the business with the precision of someone who had learned to be precise the hard way and had never forgotten why it mattered. She also began, informally, to help other women in the community with their own accounts and legal paperwork, the wives of homesteaders who were managing their household finances and did not always have the tools to do it well. She charged nothing for this. She did it because she remembered what it had cost her not to have it, and because she believed, practically and deeply, that women having real knowledge of the documents that governed their lives was not a luxury but a necessity. She wrote to Agnes every month. Agnes was still in Redemption Creek, still teaching, still writing letters to school boards when they tried to constrain what she could teach. She had also, she admitted in one letter with the bashfulness of someone who expected to be teased, begun a correspondence with Jonas Webb's new ranch manager, a man from Tennessee named Samuel Greer, who had come with good references and had apparently been reading every book in Jonas's modest library, and discussing them with Agnes on Sunday afternoons. Opal wrote back to say that she expected to be told the moment this became something more than book discussion, and Agnes wrote back 3 months later to say that it had become something more. They visited Redemption Creek in the summer of 1881, traveling south with Thomas, who was 17 months old and had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. Clara Hutchins looked at Thomas with the expression of someone who respected competence in all its forms and said, "He has his mother's eyes and his father's chin. That is a good combination." She had retired from the Dusty Rose the previous year, sold it to a woman named Irene who was, by all accounts, managing it well, and was living in the house she owned on the south end of town, growing an impressive vegetable garden that she clearly took more personal satisfaction in than she would ever admit. Verna Culp was the same, which was reassuring. Verna seemed to occupy a particular category of human being that did not change because change was inefficient. They stopped at Jonas Webb's ranch on the way back north, and Agnes was there. She was engaged to Samuel Greer now, who turned out to be a quiet, deliberate man with kind eyes and a handshake that Ira said told you everything you needed to know. They sat on Jonas's porch in the warm evening and talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular, which was one of the best kinds of conversation. The road home through the Colorado country was beautiful in the way that was almost too much, the mountains enormous to the west, the evening air clean and cool, the stars beginning to show above the horizon before the sun was fully down. Ira drove. Opal sat beside him with Thomas asleep across her lap, the boy's dark hair damp at the temples from the warmth. She looked at the stars and thought about all the roads she had taken to get here, the ones that had seemed like mistakes at the time, and the ones that had seemed like choices, and the ones that had been somewhere in the difficult middle. She thought about the farm in Missouri and the marriage in Kansas, and the silver claim in New Mexico, and the kitchen of the Dusty Rose. And she thought about a borrowed mule and $3 and a busted lip. And she thought about a man drinking water at a bar in the middle of a saloon, and reading a 2-week-old newspaper with complete and genuine attention. She thought about what he had said to her that first night she had sat beside him, and told him the truth of herself without apology. Good. Now you will not make new ones. She had not made new ones. She had made new things instead, a business, a home, a son, a life with someone who looked at the world the way his mother had taught him to look at it, with patience and care and the full intention of seeing it clearly. She had made a friendship with a practical woman in Colorado and maintained one with a kind woman in Texas, and built small acts of use into the fabric of her days. The accounts she kept for her neighbors, the documents she helped women read, the particular knowledge she had paid for, and was using now in service of others who had not yet had to pay for it. She was 29 years old. She had a husband she loved with the bone-deep, unshowy certainty of a love that had been built from honesty and trust and accumulated time, a love that had never needed to be dramatic because it had always been real. She had a son who would grow up on good land with parents who knew themselves and each other, and were not afraid of the hard thing. She had a community that counted on them, and a work that mattered, and evenings that ended with the same man beside her on the same porch looking at the same mountains, which was not a small thing. It was the whole enormous thing, the thing she had not been able to name when she had been missing it. "Ira," she said. He said, not taking his eyes off the road, the easy attentiveness of a man who was always genuinely present. "I want you to know something. Tell me." "I am glad I made all of it," she said. "Every mistake. I am glad I married wrong and trusted wrong and signed the wrong papers and stayed too long and left too late, because all of it brought me here to exactly this, and I would not change a single thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know. You know. I know because you told me the night we first talked that you were running towards something you had not figured out yet. And you did figure it out. You were just taking the long route." His voice was quiet and warm. The longest routes sometimes go through the best country. She looked at him in the dark, at the profile of a man who was hers, and whom she was wholly and without reservation, and she put her hand on his arm and said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say, and the horses moved steadily forward on the road through the Colorado night, and above them the stars were doing the thing they did in a sky without competing light, being utterly and perfectly themselves, and the mountains stood ahead in their dark patience. And Thomas slept in her lap with the boneless completeness of a child who has never had reason to be anything other than at peace. And she thought that this, right here, exactly this was the arrival. They came home in the early morning, when the sky was turning the pale color that preceded the first real light, and the creek was running with a sound she had come to love as completely as any sound she knew. Ira carried Thomas inside without waking him and put him in his crib, and then they stood in the doorway of their bedroom in the pre-dawn quiet, and she leaned her head against his chest and felt his arms come around her, and they stood like that for a long moment in the way of people who have nothing to prove and nothing to perform and everything they need. "Good life," he said, against her hair. "The best one," she said. In the autumn of 1882, Agnes married Samuel Greer in a small ceremony in Redemption Creek, and Opal traveled south for it with Ira and Thomas, and also with the fact of her second pregnancy, which she had told Ira about 2 weeks prior and which they had celebrated quietly over coffee at the kitchen table, the way they celebrated most things, privately and completely. Agnes was a beautiful bride in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with the happiness on her face, the complete and unguarded happiness of someone who had found exactly what they had hoped for. Samuel stood beside her with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck and was grateful for it, which Opal recognized as the correct expression for the occasion. At the reception, which Clara attended in a good dress and smoked her pipe outside rather than in, Opal found herself standing with Verna Culp near the edge of the yard, looking at the gathered community of a small town in the last amber light of a Texas October. "You look well," Verna said in her efficient way, which was the most elaborate compliment she gave. "I am well," Opal said. "Happy? Very." Verna nodded as though filing this accurately. "Good," she said. "You earned it." Opal thought about that word earned. She had not thought of it in those terms as something earned. She had thought of it as something built, gradually and carefully, from materials she had acquired through experience she would not have chosen but would not now give back. But perhaps earned was the right word too. Perhaps both things were true. Her daughter was born in the spring of 1883. They named her Clara Ruth, for Clara Hutchins, who had given Opal a kitchen and a wage when she needed them most, and for Ruth, the woman Ira had loved and lost at 24, whose name deserved to continue in the world. Clara Ruth Mercer came into the world making her opinions known immediately, and Ira held her in the crook of his arm and looked at her with the face that had no guard left on it, just the open thing, and Opal watched him and felt the love expand inside her to accommodate one more person in the way that love has the remarkable property of doing, not dividing but multiplying, growing larger to hold more. Thomas, who was 3, approached his new sister with the seriousness of a child conducting a formal investigation, examined her thoroughly, and declared that she was acceptable, which Opal and Ira took as high praise from a 3-year-old and celebrated accordingly. The trading post continued to grow in the slow, solid way of things built on real need. They hired a young man named Pedro Ortiz Consuela and Miguel's eldest, who was 17 and serious and good with figures, to help with the supply side, and he learned quickly and worked with a focus that reminded Opal of herself, the particular intensity of someone who understood what they were working toward. The land itself flourished under Ira's care and the help of Miguel Ortiz, who knew the local soil and the local seasons better than anyone, and shared that knowledge freely. They expanded the kitchen garden to a proper vegetable plot, added 2 milk cows, planted a small orchard of apple trees whose first real harvest was still years away, but whose planting was an act of faith in the future that Opal found she had no difficulty making. Faith in the future. She had not always had that. She had had, for years, a kind of brittle hope, the hope of someone who had been disappointed often enough to be unsure whether they were allowed to hope too fully. But real faith, the kind you built slowly from the solid materials of lived experience, that had come to her in Colorado, in this place, in this life, and she held it carefully and used it well. On a morning in October of 1884, when Thomas was 4 and Clara Ruth was 18 months old, and the apple orchard they had planted was growing steadily toward the trees they would eventually be, Opal woke before the sun, which she often did, a habit from her years of cooking early mornings that she had never entirely shed. She made coffee and took it outside to the step, where the air was sharp with the promise of coming cold, and the creek below the property was catching the first pre-dawn light. Ira came out behind her, quiet in the way he was always quiet in the mornings, and sat beside her with his own cup, and they looked at the land they had built something on together. 6 years since she had ridden into Redemption Creek on a borrowed mule with a busted lip and $3, and the accumulated weight of 5 years of mistakes. 6 years since she had stood in a general store and told a stranger she was running toward something she had not figured out yet. 5 years since a man had sat across from her in a lamplit saloon and told her that her mistakes were not her failures but her education, and looked at her without flinching, and offered her coffee and honesty and time. "What are you thinking?" Ira asked, in the companionable way of a man who was genuinely curious about the answer. "About the route," she said, "the long one." He nodded slowly, understanding her reference, and looked at the mountains going pink with the first light. "You took it well," he said. "I had good company at the end of it," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the sun came up over the eastern horizon and laid itself across their land in a long, golden line that moved through the orchard trees and across the garden, and up the slope to where the trading post stood solid and real against the morning sky. Thomas called out from inside, the particular demanding call of a 4-year-old, who had decided that sleep was over and everyone else's was too. Clara Ruth's voice followed immediately in enthusiastic agreement, because she had from her earliest weeks been constitutionally unable to be left out of anything. Opal stood and stretched and went inside, and the kitchen filled up with small voices and morning light and the smell of coffee, and her children were at the table and her husband was coming through the door behind her, and outside the mountain stood patient in the clean October air, and the creek ran below in its steady way, and the apple trees grew toward the future at their own pace, and everything was exactly as it was and exactly as it should be, entirely present, entirely real, entirely and completely hers. She looked around at all of it, the familiar, beloved, hard-won, chosen, built, real all of it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who knows where she is and how she got there and would not change a single step of the road, because every step, including the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones, had brought her to this exact and perfect place. She rolled up her sleeves and began making breakfast, and the day began as good days do, with the ordinary and the extraordinary so completely woven together that you could no longer tell them apart, which was the whole point, which was everything.